The boardroom was silent in that way only expensive rooms ever were, thick with polished wood, muted light, and the quiet confidence of people who believed the world bent naturally in their direction. The white CEO sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her tailored suit immaculate, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested superiority rather than professionalism. She had built her reputation on control, decisiveness, and an unshakable belief that she could read people instantly. When the black investor entered the room, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about him at first glance. Calm demeanor, well-fitted but understated suit, eyes observant rather than eager. He introduced himself politely, extending his hand across the table, a gesture so ordinary it should have passed unnoticed, but it didn't. The CEO paused, her eyes flicking briefly to his hand before returning to her tablet, deliberately ignoring the gesture. The room felt the shift instantly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a small fracture in the air, a moment heavy enough that everyone present registered it, even if no one dared acknowledge it. The investor slowly withdrew his hand, his expression unchanged, offering a small nod instead. He took his seat without a word, as if nothing unusual had occurred, but the silence that followed screamed louder than any insult. The CEO continued the meeting with crisp efficiency, outlining projections, dismissing suggestions, and speaking in a tone that made it clear she believed she was doing him a favor by allowing him into the room at all. She asked pointed questions, not to understand, but to test, to assert dominance, to remind everyone who held the power. The investor answered calmly, concisely, never rising to the bait, never displaying frustration. If anything, his composure seemed to unsettle her. When the meeting ended, she stood, gathered her things, and left without a backward glance, convinced she had just dealt with another minor distraction in a long line of people seeking her approval. What she didn't realize was that the handshake she refused was not just a social slight, it was a signal, and she had failed to read it. The investor left the building quietly, making no scene, speaking to no one on his way out. That night, the CEO slept soundly, secure in her position, unaware that emails were already being drafted, phone calls quietly placed, and decisions made in rooms far more powerful than hers. By the next morning, the first crack appeared. Her assistant, usually composed, entered her office pale and tense, mentioning that a major partner had postponed a call without explanation. Then came another message, an investor pulling out of a deal they had verbally agreed upon just days earlier. By noon, her inbox was flooded with vague but troubling updates, delayed approvals, sudden compliance reviews, unexpected withdrawals. None of it made sense. She prided herself on control, on foresight, on being 10 steps ahead, yet everything seemed to be unraveling at once. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the truth began to surface. A board member requested an urgent meeting, his tone unusually cautious. He explained, carefully choosing his words, that the investor from the previous day was not who she thought he was. He wasn't just another wealthy individual seeking a seat at the table. He was a gatekeeper, a quiet power broker with influence across multiple funds, advisory boards, and international partnerships. He was known for moving silently, for opening doors or closing them without ever raising his voice. And more importantly, he was known for one thing above all else. He valued respect more than profit. The CEO felt a chill crawl up her spine as realization hit. She replayed the moment in her mind, the extended hand, her deliberate refusal, the calm withdrawal. It suddenly felt grotesque in its clarity. This wasn't about business acumen or strategy, it was about character, and she had failed spectacularly. The board member didn't accuse her outright, but the implication was devastating. Deals were stalling not because of market conditions, but because trust had evaporated. People were distancing themselves quietly, unwilling to associate with a leadership style that revealed such blatant disregard. Panic set in. The CEO, who had built her empire on confidence, now felt it slipping through her fingers. She spent the evening making calls, trying to salvage relationships, but doors that had once swung open effortlessly now remained firmly shut.
No one raised their voice. No one confronted her directly. They simply declined, delayed, or ignored her altogether. It was a masterclass in quiet power, and she was on the receiving end. By the next morning, desperation had replaced arrogance. She requested another meeting with the investor, framing it as a misunderstanding, an opportunity to align visions. The response came hours later, brief and polite, granting her 15 minutes the following afternoon. Those 15 minutes suddenly felt more important than any deal she had ever closed. When the day arrived, she arrived early, pacing the room, rehearsing apologies she had never imagined she would need to make. When he entered, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time the imbalance was unmistakable. She stood immediately, extending her hand, her movements almost too eager. He accepted the handshake calmly, his grip firm but unremarkable, his expression unreadable. She began speaking quickly, explaining, justifying, attempting to reframe the previous encounter as a misunderstanding, a lapse, anything but what it was. But he stopped her gently, raising a hand, his voice calm and measured. He told her he understood business pressures, competition, and ambition. What he did not understand, he said, was disrespect. He explained that in his world, trust was built not just on numbers alone, but on how people treated others when they believed no one important was watching. He told her he had no interest in humiliating her or destroying her company, but he would not align himself with someone who saw people as disposable. The words landed hard.
The boardroom was silent in that way only expensive rooms ever were, thick with polished wood, muted light, and the quiet confidence of people who believed the world bent naturally in their direction. The white CEO sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her tailored suit immaculate, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested superiority rather than professionalism. She had built her reputation on control, decisiveness, and an unshakable belief that she could read people instantly. When the black investor entered the room, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about him at first glance. Calm demeanor, well-fitted but understated suit, eyes observant rather than eager. He introduced himself politely, extending his hand across the table, a gesture so ordinary it should have passed unnoticed, but it didn't. The CEO paused, her eyes flicking briefly to his hand before returning to her tablet, deliberately ignoring the gesture. The room felt the shift instantly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a small fracture in the air, a moment heavy enough that everyone present registered it, even if no one dared acknowledge it. The investor slowly withdrew his hand, his expression unchanged, offering a small nod instead. He took his seat without a word, as if nothing unusual had occurred, but the silence that followed screamed louder than any insult. The CEO continued the meeting with crisp efficiency, outlining projections, dismissing suggestions, and speaking in a tone that made it clear she believed she was doing him a favor by allowing him into the room at all. She asked pointed questions, not to understand, but to test, to assert dominance, to remind everyone who held the power. The investor answered calmly, concisely, never rising to the bait, never displaying frustration. If anything, his composure seemed to unsettle her. When the meeting ended, she stood, gathered her things, and left without a backward glance, convinced she had just dealt with another minor distraction in a long line of people seeking her approval. What she didn't realize was that the handshake she refused was not just a social slight, it was a signal, and she had failed to read it. The investor left the building quietly, making no scene, speaking to no one on his way out. That night, the CEO slept soundly, secure in her position, unaware that emails were already being drafted, phone calls quietly placed, and decisions made in rooms far more powerful than hers. By the next morning, the first crack appeared. Her assistant, usually composed, entered her office pale and tense, mentioning that a major partner had postponed a call without explanation. Then came another message, an investor pulling out of a deal they had verbally agreed upon just days earlier. By noon, her inbox was flooded with vague but troubling updates, delayed approvals, sudden compliance reviews, unexpected withdrawals. None of it made sense.
She prided herself on control, on foresight, on being 10 steps ahead, yet everything seemed to be unraveling at once. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the truth began to surface. A board member requested an urgent meeting, his tone unusually cautious. He explained, carefully choosing his words, that the investor from the previous day was not who she thought he was. He wasn't just another wealthy individual seeking a seat at the table. He was a gatekeeper, a quiet power broker with influence across multiple funds, advisory boards, and international partnerships. He was known for moving silently, for opening doors or closing them without ever raising his voice. And more importantly, he was known for one thing above all else. He valued respect more than profit. The CEO felt a chill crawl up her spine as realization hit. She replayed the moment in her mind, the extended hand, her deliberate refusal, the calm withdrawal. It suddenly felt grotesque in its clarity. This wasn't about business.
The aftermath of that meeting lingered in her mind far longer than she expected. She returned to her office carrying a weight that no balance sheet could measure, replaying every expression, every word, every unspoken truth that had surfaced in that quiet room. For the first time in her career, success no longer felt solid beneath her feet. It felt conditional, fragile, dependent not on how sharp her strategies were, but on how deeply she understood people. Employees who once approached her with rehearsed confidence now watched her closely, sensing a shift they couldn't quite name. She noticed it too, the way conversations paused when she entered a room, the way eyes searched her face for cues of the old arrogance or signs of something new. And slowly, deliberately, she chose something new. She began asking questions without cutting people off. She allowed silence to exist without rushing to dominate it. She acknowledged ideas that didn't come from the usual voices. None of it earned applause, but it earned something far rarer: trust, rebuilding itself inch by inch. Still, the consequences of her earlier actions didn't vanish overnight. Some partnerships never returned. Some opportunities closed permanently, quiet casualties of a moment she could never undo. At night, she lay awake realizing that power was not taken away from her in anger. It had simply withdrawn itself as naturally as it had once arrived. And that realization was humbling in a way no public scandal could have been. Meanwhile, the investor continued his work as he always had, moving through rooms where decisions shaped markets and futures, never raising his voice, never demanding recognition. He spoke rarely of what had happened, because for him it was never about revenge, it was about standards. He believed that the smallest interactions revealed the largest truths, and that how someone treated another person when nothing was at stake said everything about how they would behave when everything was. When colleagues asked him about the CEO, he simply said she was learning. That single word carried more weight than condemnation ever could. He watched from a distance as her company slowly stabilized, not because she had regained control, but because she had learned to share it. To him, that mattered more than profit margins or quarterly growth. It meant the lesson had landed where it needed to. Months later, they crossed paths again at an industry conference. This time there was no spotlight, no boardroom, no power play. Just two professionals standing in line for coffee, surrounded by noise and movement. She greeted him first, not with practiced charm, but with genuine warmth. The handshake that followed was unremarkable to anyone watching, but to her it felt symbolic, a reminder etched into muscle memory. They exchanged a few words about the event, about the market, about nothing particularly important. Yet beneath that casual exchange was an understanding that something fundamental had changed. She no longer saw him as a variable in a deal, and he no longer saw her as someone unaware of her own blind spots. They parted without promises, without expectations, but with mutual respect. Earned, not assumed. Back at her company, stories began circulating quietly, not about the investor or the meeting, but about the transformation people were witnessing.
Junior staff felt heard for the first time. Senior leaders adjusted their tone, mirroring the shift at the top. The culture didn't become perfect, but it became conscious. And consciousness, she learned, was the beginning of real leadership. She stopped measuring her success solely by expansion and started measuring it by sustainability of people, of values, of trust. The irony was not lost on her that the moment she relinquished the illusion of superiority, her influence actually deepened. Investors returned slowly, cautiously, not because they were impressed, but because they sensed authenticity replacing arrogance. She never spoke publicly about the handshake she refused. There was no press release, no keynote confession. But privately, she kept that memory close, revisiting it whenever impatience or entitlement threatened to resurface. It became her internal checkpoint, the moment she measured herself against when making decisions. She understood now that respect was not a gesture reserved for those deemed worthy, but a baseline owed to everyone. And she understood that mercy, when extended, was not a weakness, but an opportunity to grow beyond who you once were. The investor had never asked her to kneel, never demanded submission, yet in facing her own reflection, she had bowed to a truth far more powerful than pride. In the end, the story was never about a CEO losing control or an investor wielding influence. It was about how quickly the roles we think define us can shift, and how a single moment can expose the foundation beneath everything we build. The boardroom, the deals, the titles, all of it mattered less than a simple human exchange, a hand extended, a choice made, a lesson learned. And for everyone who heard fragments of the story later, stripped of names and specifics, the message remained clear. Power does not announce itself loudly, and respect costs nothing until you refuse to give it.
Time passed, but the echo of that lesson never truly faded. Even as quarterly reports improved and the company found its footing again, the CEO sensed that something irreversible had occurred within her. The version of herself that once walked into rooms expecting automatic deference no longer existed. In her place stood someone more cautious, more observant, and strangely, more grounded. She began to notice how often authority had shielded her from self-reflection in the past, how success had insulated her from hearing truths she didn't want to confront. Now, without that insulation, she felt exposed, but also more alive. Leadership meetings shifted tone entirely. Where once disagreement felt like a challenge to her dominance, it now felt like an invitation to understand perspectives beyond her own. She learned that strength didn't diminish when shared, it multiplied. And each time she chose patience over ego, she silently acknowledged the unseen teacher who had forced her to confront that reality without ever raising his voice. The ripple effects extended beyond her company in ways she hadn't anticipated. Word traveled through professional circles, not as gossip, but as observation. People spoke quietly about how she had changed, how she listened differently now, how she seemed less interested in asserting control and more focused on cultivating alignment. Some admired it. Others were skeptical, assuming it was temporary, a calculated response to a near disaster. But consistency has a way of revealing sincerity, and over time, even the skeptics noticed the pattern held. She stopped dominating panels and began crediting teams. She stopped speaking over others and began amplifying voices often overlooked. It wasn't performative. There were no grand declarations, just repeated, intentional choices that slowly redefined her reputation. For the investor, this evolution was confirmation rather than surprise. He had seen it before, in different forms, across different industries and personalities. People rarely changed because they were told to. They changed because they were confronted with consequences they couldn't negotiate away. He never followed up to check on her progress, never sought acknowledgement for his role in her transformation. His philosophy remained simple. Lessons delivered with dignity had a longer shelf life.
Occasionally, when mutual contacts mentioned her name, he listened quietly, noting the subtle shift in how they spoke about her, not with fear or awe, but with respect. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between power imposed and power earned. Years later, during a closed-door mentorship session for young executives, the CEO shared a story, without names, without details that could be traced back. She spoke about a moment early in her leadership when she believed competence excused coldness, when she mistook authority for entitlement. She described how a single interaction dismantled that illusion and forced her to confront the kind of leader she was becoming. The room was silent as she spoke, not because the story was dramatic, but because it was uncomfortably relatable. Many in the audience recognized themselves in the version of her she no longer was. She ended by saying that the most expensive mistake she ever made cost her nothing financially, but nearly cost her everything else, and that respect, once withheld, demanded far more effort to restore than it ever would have to give freely. After the session, a young professional approached her, visibly nervous, thanking her for her honesty. The CEO shook his hand firmly, looking him directly in the eyes, fully present in the moment. It was a small gesture, invisible to anyone else, but deeply intentional to her. In that instant, she understood how cycles were broken, not through punishment or public shaming, but through awareness passed forward. The investor had interrupted her trajectory just enough to allow correction, and she had chosen to continue that interruption in others, quietly, deliberately. The world, of course, continued to reward confidence, decisiveness, and ambition, but she now understood the difference between confidence and arrogance, decisiveness and dismissal, ambition and disregard. She learned that the most influential leaders weren't those who demanded recognition, but those whose presence elevated the room without diminishing anyone in it. And she carried that understanding into every negotiation, every introduction, every first impression, because first impressions, she now knew, were not about dominance, they were about acknowledgement. In the end, the story never appeared in headlines, never became a viral scandal, or a cautionary case study taught in business schools. It lived instead in subtle shifts, in careers redirected, in cultures softened, in egos tempered. It lived in a handshake that was finally returned, not as a transaction, but as a recognition of shared humanity. And for the CEO who once believed power meant standing above others, the greatest lesson was this: true authority is felt most deeply when it kneels to humility long before it demands respect.
As the years unfolded, the lesson continued to surface in moments she never could have predicted. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of an uncomfortable pause before she spoke, a reminder to listen first. Other times it arrived sharply, when an old instinct to judge or dismiss flared up and had to be consciously restrained. She began to understand that growth was not a destination she had reached in that boardroom years ago, but a discipline she had to practice daily. There were days she failed, moments when impatience slipped through, when authority tempted her to take shortcuts. But the difference now was awareness. She noticed it, she corrected it, and that alone marked a profound shift from the person she once was. Power no longer felt like something she had to defend aggressively. It felt like something entrusted to her, conditional on how responsibly she used it. Her company gradually became known for something unexpected, not just innovation or profitability, but culture. People spoke about how meetings felt different there, how voices that were usually drowned out elsewhere were given space. Recruitment changed, not because of new slogans, but because employees themselves became ambassadors, telling others what it felt like to work under leadership that saw them as human beings first. The CEO listened to these stories with quiet gratitude, never taking credit openly, never denying her past either. She understood now that leadership narratives didn't need to be flawless to be powerful. They needed to be honest. And honesty, she had learned, was far more disarming than perfection.
Occasionally, she wondered what would have happened if the investor had reacted differently that first day. If he had confronted her publicly, humiliated her, or walked away loudly, she suspected she would have hardened instead of changed. Pride would have found a way to defend itself. Instead, his restraint had forced her to sit alone with her behavior, stripped of excuses. That solitude had been unbearable at first, but it was also where the transformation began. She realized that mercy, when paired with boundaries, was one of the most powerful forces in any human interaction. It left no room for denial, only reflection. The investor, for his part, continued to operate in the background of the industry, his influence growing precisely because he never sought visibility. Younger professionals gravitated toward him, sensing wisdom in his calm. Asking for guidance, he offered sparingly but thoughtfully. When asked about leadership, he rarely spoke about strategy. He spoke about character, about how people revealed themselves in small moments more than grand ones, about how respect was not a tactic, but a value that shaped everything it touched. He never mentioned the CEO by name, but the principles he shared bore the unmistakable imprint of that encounter. In that way, the lesson multiplied, passed quietly from one generation to the next. One evening, long after the crisis had faded into memory, the CEO attended a private dinner with leaders from different sectors. The conversation turned to failure, to the moments that changed them most. When it was her turn, she spoke simply, describing how she once believed success excused her from basic decency. She didn't dramatize it, she didn't soften it. She spoke with the calm acceptance of someone who had made peace with her past. Around the table, heads nodded, some in recognition, some in discomfort. She recognized that look now, the look of someone standing at the edge of a lesson they hadn't yet learned. As the night ended, she stepped outside, the city lights reflecting off glass and steel, symbols of ambition she once worshipped without question. She realized she no longer felt the same hunger to dominate those spaces. What she felt instead was responsibility, to use her influence to open doors instead of guarding them, to acknowledge hands extended instead of ignoring them. The memory of that refused handshake no longer filled her with shame alone, it filled her with resolve. In quiet moments, she sometimes reflected on how fragile reputations truly were, how quickly power could shift, how one decision could alter the trajectory of countless lives. She understood now that leadership was less about being right and more about being accountable, less about winning and more about honoring the people who made winning possible. And she carried that understanding forward, knowing it would be tested again and again. The story, when told in fragments by those who sensed its outline, often focused on reversal, the mighty brought low, the overlooked revealed as powerful. But the deeper truth was simpler and far more universal. It was about recognition, about seeing another human being fully, without filters of bias or assumption, about understanding that respect is not something you grant once you are proven wrong, but something you offer before you are proven wrong. And somewhere, in countless boardrooms, hallways, and first meetings yet to happen, hands continued to be extended. Each one carried a choice, a moment, a quiet test of character. And for one CEO who learned the hard way, that choice would never be taken lightly.
The lessons of that day became woven into every fiber of her professional life, shaping her decisions in ways she could not have anticipated. Even routine interactions were colored by the memory of the handshake she had refused. Every greeting, every introduction, every negotiation became an opportunity to practice the respect she once overlooked. She discovered that small gestures, acknowledging someone's presence, listening fully before responding, offering credit where it was due, had exponential effects. Teams that were once disengaged became energized, partnerships that were once tentative strengthened, and her influence, paradoxically, expanded not through dominance but through trust. She began to understand that power is not defined by who can assert it most forcefully, but by who can inspire confidence, loyalty, and respect without demanding it.
The transformation was quiet, subtle, yet undeniable. Despite the outward success, the internal change was not always comfortable. She faced moments of self-doubt, nights of reflection when she questioned whether she had truly internalized the lesson or simply adopted behaviors to regain favor. There were times when frustration surfaced, when old habits of impatience and superiority crept into her responses. But each time she called herself, paused, and considered the ripple effect of her words and actions. She realized that humility was not weakness, but a form of strength that required constant vigilance. The investor's calm, measured approach had instilled in her a profound understanding. True leadership is forged not in moments of triumph, but in the recognition of one's own fallibility. As the company continued to grow, she noticed subtle shifts in the culture that had once been rigid and hierarchical. Meetings were no longer arenas for asserting dominance, but forums for collaboration. Junior employees spoke up, knowing their ideas would be heard. Senior staff engaged in dialogue rather than monologue. Even clients commented on the change, remarking how approachable and thoughtful leadership had become. She realized that respect, once neglected, had a way of multiplying when genuinely cultivated. And every time she noticed it, she silently remembered the hand she had once refused and the quiet power it had held. The investor, who had been a catalyst for this transformation, remained a distant but enduring influence. He never claimed credit, never sought acknowledgement, but his impact was evident in every decision she made and every culture shift she nurtured. Occasionally, industry peers would ask her about her mentorship, her sources of wisdom. She would speak of lessons learned in unexpected ways, the importance of observing behavior over titles, and the value of treating everyone with dignity. She never detailed the specific encounter, understanding that the real lesson was not the story itself, but the change it inspired. Over time, she began mentoring others, sharing insights not through lectures, but through guided experience. She encouraged reflection, self-awareness, and accountability. She emphasized that leadership was not just about results, but about the ethical and emotional context in which results were achieved. She saw potential leaders stumble, just as she once had, blinded by ego and impatience, and she guided them carefully, knowing that influence without integrity was empty, and that respect, once earned, created legacies far more enduring than wealth or status. Even in moments of personal challenge, the memory of that first refused handshake surfaced as a moral compass. When negotiations became tense, she would remember the calm authority of the investor, the quiet power of restraint, and the consequences of dismissing another human being. It reminded her that accountability is never outsourced, that character is measured not in public acclaim, but in private choices, and that one small act of arrogance could undo years of effort in an instant. The lesson had become inseparable from her identity. And so the CEO's journey continued, shaped by a single pivotal encounter. She had been humbled, tested, and ultimately transformed. She moved forward with a deeper understanding of what it meant to lead, to influence, and to wield authority responsibly. In every handshake, every meeting, every conversation, she carried the imprint of that moment, ensuring that respect, empathy, and integrity were no longer optional, but foundational. The world could still be harsh, unpredictable, and competitive, but she now faced it armed not with ego, but with insight, and the quiet, enduring power of humility.
The transformation did not stop with her company. It began to extend into her personal life as well. She noticed herself listening more carefully to friends and family, giving full attention rather than multitasking or brushing off opinions she once considered trivial. Conversations that would have previously been dominated by her voice now became opportunities for understanding. Even in social settings, she found herself pausing, considering the impact of her words, realizing that respect extended far beyond boardrooms and business deals. She had come to understand that influence and empathy were inseparable. One could not exist fully without the other. And in this awareness, she discovered a sense of fulfillment that success alone had never brought. Clients and partners, sensing the subtle yet profound shift in her approach, began to respond differently. Meetings that were once transactional became collaborative. Negotiations that were once adversarial now involved mutual problem-solving. She noticed that people were not only willing to work with her, but they actively sought her guidance, not out of fear or obligation, but out of respect. It was a new kind of authority, one built on character rather than titles, and it allowed her to navigate challenges with a confidence that felt authentic rather than performative. She realized that the power to influence others effectively was directly tied to the care and attention she showed them in every interaction. The investor remained an invisible mentor in her life. Occasionally, she would recall the calmness in his voice, the patience in his demeanor, and the silent authority he carried simply by standing firm in his principles. His example had become a template for how she conducted herself. She found herself unconsciously emulating his composure in tense situations, his ability to assert boundaries without arrogance, and his capacity to recognize the humanity in others before considering their value to her personally or professionally. That single handshake she had refused was no longer a moment of shame. It was a constant reminder of the importance of humility, respect, and accountability in every encounter. Over time, the narrative around her began to shift in the industry. Former skeptics who had doubted her resilience now noted the subtle but unmistakable depth of her leadership. Stories circulated not about her wealth, her deals, or her influence, but about her integrity, her capacity for reflection, and her ability to learn from mistakes. Employees who had once feared expressing dissent now offered honest feedback, knowing it would be received thoughtfully rather than dismissed. Partnerships that had been fragile strengthened, built not on contracts alone, but on mutual respect and trust. She realized that reputation, once considered fragile, could be rebuilt and strengthened when anchored in consistent ethical behavior. Even her own self-perception had changed dramatically. Where once she defined herself by achievements, accolades, and the ability to command attention, she now measured herself by the quality of her interactions, the respect she cultivated, and the lessons she passed forward. She began documenting her experiences not for public acclaim, but as a personal guide to ensure she never reverted to old habits. Reflection became routine. She assessed decisions not only for profitability, but for their ethical implications and impact on people. Every choice, no matter how small, was filtered through the lens of humility and respect, a filter she had never considered necessary before that pivotal encounter. And while the world around her continued to challenge, compete, and test, she faced it differently now. Setbacks became opportunities to learn rather than threats to her ego. Disagreements became invitations for dialogue rather than arenas for dominance. She discovered that true influence did not require force or intimidation, but patience, awareness, and integrity. The hand she had once refused to shake had quietly reshaped the trajectory of her life, leaving her more resilient, more perceptive, and far more capable of leading not just with authority, but with wisdom and empathy. The transformation reached even the smallest corners of her daily life. Simple decisions, how she greeted an intern, how she responded to a critical email, how she navigated casual hallway conversations became intentional exercises in awareness. Where she had once prioritized speed, efficiency, and asserting authority, she now prioritized clarity, understanding, and acknowledgement. She noticed the subtle ways in which people responded, smiles that lingered longer, ideas shared more freely, hesitations that disappeared, and realized that respect was contagious. The ripple effect of treating people with dignity was profound. It shifted not just relationships, but the very energy of her workplace.
Meetings became collaborative, not combative. Brainstorming sessions became opportunities for creativity rather than competition. And in every interaction, she carried the quiet reminder of the handshake she had once denied, the moment that had unveiled her blind spots and taught her the cost of arrogance. Her reflection was no longer superficial. She examined not just her professional habits, but her values, her assumptions, and the biases she had unknowingly carried. She confronted uncomfortable truths about how she had judged others, how she had equated confidence with superiority, and how she had underestimated the quiet influence of those she considered lesser. It was humbling, exhausting, and at times frightening to face herself with such scrutiny. Yet the process was liberating. By acknowledging her flaws, she discovered a resilience that was deeper and more sustainable than the bravado she had relied on for decades. She began mentoring emerging leaders, not as a show of dominance, but as an exercise in shaping culture. She shared lessons subtly, guiding conversations toward reflection, encouraging accountability, and demonstrating how leadership required both competence and character. Outside of work, the transformation rippled through her personal relationships. Friends noticed she listened more, that she weighed her words carefully, that she sought to understand before reacting. Family felt seen in ways they hadn't before, and colleagues noticed a subtle calm that emanated from her presence. People no longer feared confrontation or criticism. They were motivated to contribute because they knew their voices mattered. In private moments, she reflected on how a single gesture, a handshake refused, had altered the trajectory of her life in ways far beyond the boardroom. She realized that influence was measured not in transactions or power plays, but in the trust and respect one cultivated through consistency, empathy, and humility. The investor, though largely absent in her day-to-day life, remained an invisible guide. She often recalled his calm demeanor, the measured way he held himself, the quiet authority he possessed simply by standing firm in his principles. His actions had taught her that true power is not loud, aggressive, or demanding. It is quiet, deliberate, and principled. She carried that lesson into every negotiation, every meeting, every handshake. She no longer sought to dominate rooms or intimidate colleagues. Instead, she aimed to inspire, elevate, and earn respect through authenticity. And over time, the results spoke for themselves. Partnerships strengthened, teams flourished, and her influence grew, not because people feared her, but because they trusted her. Even setbacks were no longer feared as failures, but embraced as lessons. She faced challenges with a clarity that came from experience, awareness, and humility. Decisions were weighed not only for their financial impact, but for their ethical and human implications. She became a model of reflective leadership, demonstrating that growth often emerges from the moments we resist most. The handshake that had once seemed trivial had become a symbol of her evolution, a reminder that respect is earned, that power is conditional, and that the most profound lessons often arrive quietly, without fanfare, yet leave an indelible mark on those willing to receive them. The story, though silent to the outside world, had transformed her completely. Where once ambition had driven her unchecked, it now operated within the bounds of empathy, insight, and ethical responsibility. She learned that true leadership was not about how high one climbed, but how firmly one could hold others up along the way. Every day became an opportunity to demonstrate the values she had once ignored. Every encounter was a chance to practice humility, respect, and awareness. And in carrying those lessons forward, she realized that her life, her career, and her influence were richer, deeper, and far more meaningful than anything she had imagined before that single, pivotal encounter.
The years continued to unfold, and with each passing day, the lessons from that pivotal moment embedded themselves more deeply into her identity. She found herself observing the smallest details in interactions, the tone of a voice, the hesitation in a pause, the subtle signals of discomfort or confidence. No longer did she rush to conclusions based on assumptions or appearances. She realized that every person she met carried stories, challenges, and insights she had yet to understand, and that acknowledging their presence fully was as important as any financial calculation she had ever made. The memory of the handshake she once refused was no longer a moment of shame. It had become a compass, guiding her toward awareness, patience, and intentionality in every action. Her leadership style evolved further as she implemented systemic changes within her organization. Policies that had previously prioritized efficiency above all else were revisited with an emphasis on respect, inclusion, and ethical accountability. Performance reviews incorporated measures of collaboration, empathy, and leadership integrity alongside results. Training programs were redesigned to highlight emotional intelligence, active listening, and conflict resolution. The shift was gradual, subtle, but undeniable. Employees felt safer speaking up, offering ideas and challenging assumptions. Meetings became forums for corrective problem-solving rather than arenas for asserting dominance. She watched as this culture took root, understanding that genuine change was slow but enduring, built on repeated choices rather than single grand gestures. Outside of her professional sphere, she began applying these principles in her personal life. Family and friends noticed a change in how she interacted, more presence, less judgment, more patience, and deeper curiosity about the experiences of others. She discovered that empathy cultivated in small, everyday interactions had a compounding effect, strengthening relationships that had previously been strained or superficial. She began to recognize the quiet power in listening fully, in validating experiences without rushing to problem solve, and in offering support without expectation of return. It was a freedom unlike anything she had felt before, to lead and succeed while remaining connected to the humanity of those around her. The investor, though distant, remained a silent benchmark in her mind. She often reflected on his composure, his unwavering adherence to principle, and the calm authority he had wielded without intimidation or ostentation. She understood now that his influence had never been about asserting power over her, but about revealing the gaps in her own character and the cost of arrogance when paired with ignorance. She carried that understanding into every encounter, every negotiation, every handshake, recognizing that authority gained through respect and integrity was far more durable than authority enforced by fear or assumption. Over time, her reputation transformed within the industry. Colleagues, competitors, and partners began to recognize not just her acumen, but the integrity that guided it. Where once her name evoked fear, it now inspired trust. Deals were secured not simply through contractual leverage, but through the confidence people had in her fairness, insight, and ethical conduct. She realized that the true measure of success was no longer in the speed of closing transactions or the scale of profit, but in the lasting impact she had on the people she worked with and the culture she fostered. Influence had become less about imposing her will and more about shaping environments where others could thrive alongside her. Challenges inevitably arose, as they always do in life and business. Setbacks tested her patience, difficult colleagues tested her restraint, and unexpected crises tested her judgment. Yet each time she returned to the lesson learned from that initial encounter. She approached problems methodically, assessing not only the financial or strategic implications, but the human impact of every choice. She realized that accountability to others and to herself required courage, discipline, and a willingness to remain humble even when under pressure. And with each test, her leadership deepened, her influence widened, and her understanding of true power expanded. Mentorship became another avenue through which she carried forward the lessons she had learned. She guided emerging leaders with patience, emphasizing reflection over reaction, empathy over ego, and integrity over expediency.
She shared stories not to showcase her past mistakes, but to illuminate the principles that had transformed her approach to leadership. She demonstrated that authority rooted in respect creates environments that endure far beyond the tenure of any single leader, and that the cultivation of trust is both a moral and strategic imperative. The leaders she mentored carried these lessons into their own spheres, multiplying the impact of the single moment that had reshaped her life. In quiet reflection, she often marveled at how a single, seemingly trivial decision, a handshake refused, had altered her trajectory so profoundly. What had once been a moment of pride and arrogance became the catalyst for growth, humility, and self-awareness. She understood now that leadership was not about being invincible or unassailable. It was about the courage to face one's own flaws, to adapt, and to continually strive for ethical excellence. Every handshake, every conversation, every interaction became an opportunity to practice the principles she had internalized, to honor the unseen lessons of that day, and to cultivate respect in a world that often overlooks it.
Over time, the transformation became second nature. She no longer had to consciously remind herself of the lesson from that first refused handshake. It had been internalized, woven into her behavior, and reflected in every interaction. The way she greeted colleagues, negotiated deals, or simply listened to someone's concern now carried a deliberate mindfulness. She understood that leadership wasn't about being feared or admired superficially. It was about building trust, modeling integrity, and consistently honoring the humanity of others. Small gestures, the patience to let someone finish speaking, the acknowledgement of ideas that weren't hers, the simple act of eye contact and presence took on a weight she had never before appreciated. These acts, seemingly minor, compounded into a culture of mutual respect that transformed her company from within. As she continued to lead, she realized that her growth extended beyond professional success. In personal relationships, she was more attentive, more compassionate, and more present. Family, friends, and even casual acquaintances noticed a difference. She listened without judgment, responded without condescension, and offered help without expectation. In doing so, she discovered the profound impact of respect and empathy outside the boardroom. Relationships that had been strained or superficial now deepened, nourished by her newfound awareness and intentionality. Her life became richer not because her circumstances had changed dramatically, but because her perception of people and her interactions with them had shifted entirely. The investor remained a quiet reference point in her mind. She recalled his calm confidence, his measured responses, and the silent authority he wielded without needing to dominate. He had shown her, without force or accusation, the importance of character, patience, and respect. That single interaction had been a turning point, an invisible teacher whose influence would echo through every decision she made for the rest of her career. She often reflected on how rare it was to encounter someone who could teach without lecturing, to influence without coercion, and to reveal truths without causing humiliation. The lessons he imparted were subtle but indelible, forming the foundation of the leader she had become. Within her company, the cultural shift became undeniable. Meetings were no longer dominated by the loudest voices. Instead, collaboration and thoughtful discussion were encouraged. Employees at all levels felt heard, valued, and empowered to contribute their ideas. Decision-making became more holistic, considering not only financial outcomes, but also ethical implications and human impact. This approach attracted new partners, retained top talent, and fostered loyalty that no contract could guarantee. She recognized that respect, once withheld, could now be extended freely, and the returns were far greater than any material gains. The ripple effect of one moment of humility had created an enduring environment of trust and integrity. Even in moments of quiet reflection, she marveled at the power of that initial encounter.
A single handshake, refused in a moment of arrogance, had revealed her blind spots and forced her to confront her shortcomings. What had once seemed trivial had become the catalyst for lasting change, guiding her toward a life and leadership style defined by respect, accountability, and empathy. She understood now that true authority does not demand recognition, it earns it through consistent demonstration of integrity and consideration. Every decision, every interaction, and every relationship became an opportunity to practice the lessons she had learned. The memory of that handshake was no longer a source of shame, but a beacon, reminding her that leadership is not measured by dominance or wealth, but the respect and trust one cultivates in every corner of life.